You see it at dinner, someone praising themselves before anyone else can speak. It looks like confidence, but this video shows a different regulation underneath. The real driver is older, quieter, and far less flattering. In modern self-love culture, public affirmation often arrives before connection does. A person enters a room already explaining their boundaries, their standards, their worth, as if preparing for impact. Some viewers feel relief watching this. Others feel a faint tightening in the chest. At a birthday dinner, a compliment is offered lightly across the table. Before it can settle, the receiver expands it, listing achievements, correcting details, reshaping the praise into something bigger and safer. The laughter pauses for a second too long, then resumes, slightly thinner. The behavior appears most clearly in timing, not in words. Validation is secured early, before it can be withdrawn or complicated. In a group chat, someone posts a filtered photo with a caption about self-growth and independence. When replies slow down, a second message follows, joking but sharp, reminding everyone of their value. The rhythm reveals something protective, almost automatic. This is often labeled narcissistic isolation, though the label describes a pattern, not a person. Isolation does not begin with rejection, it begins with preemptive self-elevation. In a workplace meeting, a small criticism is raised about a project delay. The response comes quickly, polished and firm, reframing the delay as vision, the oversight as strategic patience. No one argues, yet the air feels less collaborative. The function hides in the interruption. Self-love language arrives at the exact moment uncertainty enters the room. What looks like pride often follows a flicker of exposure. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that early humans survived by guarding status carefully within the group. Status meant safety, and safety meant belonging. When belonging feels unstable, the nervous system may push status forward instead. At a cafe, two friends talk about relationships. One admits feeling confused about mixed signals. The other shifts quickly, describing how they no longer tolerate low-energy people, how their standards are unshakable now. The vulnerability dissolves, replaced by certainty. The shift is subtle, almost admirable, yet something has been avoided. The atmosphere changes from shared uncertainty to controlled narrative. Carl Jung warned that the persona can harden when it protects something fragile underneath. In modern self-love culture, the persona is often praised as empowerment. But notice when it activates. It rarely appears during stable warmth. It emerges when ambiguity, criticism, or dependency enters the space. On social media, a long post declares radical self-acceptance. Within minutes, the author deletes and reposts it with sharper wording, clarifying their strength more forcefully. The edit happens before anyone openly disagrees. This is not vanity in its simplest form. It is anticipation. Anticipation of misunderstanding, of being reduced, of losing control over how one is seen. The isolation grows quietly from this anticipation. If others cannot reach the unpolished self, connection becomes performance. Performance feels safer because it can be directed, and control feels safer than mutual dependence. The pattern does not begin in adulthood. It had to be learned when uncertainty felt dangerous. And that learning leaves traces long before anyone calls it self-love. If you're still watching, you probably notice things most people miss. You question behavior. You look beneath the surface. If that sounds like you, subscribe. This channel was made for minds like yours. Long before captions about worth appeared, the nervous system was studying reactions. A child shows a drawing, watching the adult's face more than their words. If the smile hesitates, the child begins explaining the drawing's meaning, defending it before critique forms. The body learns that approval can flicker. Ambiguity becomes a small alarm. In some homes, affection arrives in waves, warm one evening, distant the next. A report card is praised for high marks, then compared to someone else's higher ones. The child absorbs a quiet rule. Value must be reinforced quickly, or it may disappear. No one names this lesson. It settles into timing instead. When tension rises, self-definition moves forward to stabilize the room. B.F. Skinner noted that behaviors repeated under intermittent reward become especially persistent. Inconsistent validation can train the mind to secure reinforcement aggressively. At school, a joke lands well one day and falls flat the next. The child begins amplifying their persona, becoming sharper, more impressive, less readable. Peers respond to the surface, not the uncertainty underneath. Safety becomes linked to impact. Impact becomes linked to survival. In adolescence, social hierarchies grow more complex. A rumor spreads briefly, then fades, but the memory of exposure lingers longer than the event itself. The teenager learns to present strength first, before others can define weakness. Vulnerability starts to feel like handing someone a script. So the script is written in advance. Evolutionary psychology suggests that exclusion once meant physical danger. Even subtle social threat can activate ancient circuitry. If belonging feels unstable, the system may inflate self-sufficiency as a shield. In a quiet kitchen, a parent dismisses tears with advice about being strong. The child stops crying mid-sentence, nodding quickly. Strength becomes associated with staying connected. Need becomes associated with distance. Over time, emotional self-containment feels virtuous. Dependence feels risky. The early environment does not have to be cruel. It only needs to be unpredictable enough that self-promotion feels safer than waiting. By adulthood, this regulation is fluent. Affirmations are not fabricated, they are rehearsed survival strategies. The person may genuinely believe in their independence. They may even feel proud of how little they need from others. What remains invisible is the original intolerance for ambiguity. Uncertainty about how one is seen still registers as threat. So certainty is manufactured internally. The culture then applauds this certainty. Posts about cutting off negativity receive immediate validation. Statements about radical independence attract admiration. The early adaptation finds social reinforcement. What once stabilized a fragile bond now gains public reward, and reinforcement strengthens the pattern further. Isolation begins to look like empowerment. The nervous system quietly recognizes something else. The old alarm has simply found better lighting, and the world now claps for the very shield that was built in private. In adult relationships, the pattern surfaces before it is recognized internally. A partner expresses disappointment about a missed call. The response arrives polished and rational, explaining personal growth, busy schedules, and high standards for communication. The original feeling fades under a monologue about self-respect. The partner notices the shift first. They sense distance where intimacy could have formed. At a family gathering, a sibling teases lightly about being hard to reach. The comment is met with a firm declaration about protecting energy and refusing drama. Laughter follows, but eye contact shortens. The protective script has interrupted something softer. At work, a colleague offers collaborative feedback on a presentation. Instead of exploring the suggestion, the presenter reframes the critique as misunderstanding their advanced approach. The room grows quieter. Authority has replaced dialogue. Others begin adjusting around this pattern. They choose safer topics. They filter honesty. Over time, the individual feels increasingly alone, yet cannot identify the moment it began. Midway through a quiet evening, scrolling through affirmations about self-worth, a thought appears briefly. Maybe I'm just built differently. The idea feels stabilizing, almost comforting. Carl Jung described how identification with a persona can distance someone from the shadow they fear. Here, the persona is fiercely self-contained. Need is rebranded as weakness. Dependency is reframed as low standards. In friendships, invitations are declined with language about prioritizing peace. When someone expresses hurt, the response centers on boundaries rather than curiosity. Conflict resolves quickly, but connection thins gradually. Others experience the surface strength first. Only later do they sense the inaccessibility beneath it. A romantic partner attempts to share insecurity. Instead of mutual vulnerability, they receive a speech about personal evolution and emotional independence. The exchange ends without argument, yet something important remains untouched. The isolation is rarely loud. It accumulates through repeated redirections away from shared uncertainty. Modern environments intensify this expression. Online spaces reward clear declarations more than complex emotions. Certainty travels faster than doubt, and each public affirmation strengthens the internal script that says contact is safer when controlled. What once guarded against rejection now quietly prevents intimacy. Few recognize the trade until the distance feels permanent. Digital platforms provide constant mirrors, but the reflections are curated. A post about self-prioritization receives hundreds of approving reactions within minutes. The nervous system registers this as safety. External validation arrives without exposure to disagreement. Algorithms favor clarity and confidence. Nuance and hesitation travel less efficiently. The culture begins rewarding statements that close conversation rather than open it. In a podcast clip, a speaker declares that needing no one is the highest form of healing. The clip spreads rapidly, detached from context. Listeners absorb the message as strength. The underlying regulation goes unnoticed. At a gym, someone films themselves discussing self-discipline and independence. The camera angle is precise, the tone unwavering. Later, alone in the locker room, their expression softens briefly before returning to composure. The performance has become integrated into identity. Cultural language shifts subtly. Boundaries become synonymous with emotional distance. Self-care becomes synonymous with emotional withdrawal. The distinction between regulation and growth blurs. Viktor Frankl described how meaning can be distorted when suffering is avoided rather than integrated. Here, discomfort is often reframed as something to eliminate quickly. Rather than staying inside relational tension, the individual elevates above it. The environment applauds the elevation. Brands adopt empowerment slogans. Influencers model detachment as maturity. The protective strategy gains economic value. Psychological costs remain quieter. Moments of loneliness increase, but are interpreted as evidence of superiority. Dependence is still coded as danger. Ambiguity is still intolerable. Yet now the culture validates this intolerance. Isolation becomes socially reinforced rather than privately endured. The individual may never pause long enough to examine the mechanism. The applause is too immediate. The silence between connections grows gradually. Awareness does not emerge through criticism. It begins when the performance no longer regulates the original alarm. At some point, affirmation stops calming the underlying tension. A post about self-worth receives praise, yet restlessness lingers afterward. The room is full of validation, but something feels uncontacted. In a quiet apartment, after declining another invitation framed as protecting peace, the silence stretches longer than expected. There is no conflict, no rejection, only absence. The mind returns to its familiar script about independence. It sounds convincing, well-practiced, even admirable, but the body remains slightly alert. Carl Jung suggested that what is not made conscious directs us from the shadows. Here, the shadow may be a simple fear of being seen without preparation. Not weak, not flawed, just unguarded. Modern self-love culture does not create this fear. It provides language that can conceal it. Narcissistic isolation, as a behavioral pattern, is less about grandiosity and more about controlled exposure. Connection requires unpredictability. Unpredictability once signaled danger. So control became the safer path. Over time, the controlled self receives admiration. The unguarded self receives little rehearsal. In the final quiet of the evening, scrolling slows. Affirmations blur into repetition. The protective persona remains intact. Yet somewhere beneath it, the original alarm still waits for contact that does not require performance. The culture may continue rewarding the shield. The individual may continue strengthening it. And awareness, when it arrives, does not dismantle the structure. It only reveals that the isolation was never about loving oneself too much. It was about fearing what might happen without the armor.